This is the story of Berend Borst, a Dutch veteran. This is his experience of the German invasion. This is the 4th episode. Borst and his comrades are stuck with their German captors. Let's begin. When we were in the garage, we could see that the battle was mainly taking place in the village. Although bullets constantly flew over and past the garage, and the occasional grenade came close, we were no longer in the middle of the fight. This brought us some calm and peace. We couldn't take much of the food supply we had in the church with us. Some had a cookie with them. In the garage, we found canned vegetables. We opened the cans, but the contents of many were spoiled, and the rest were eaten raw. Here in the garage, we also had to wait. Some of us had crawled under cars and others under the workbench, but most had to settle for a spot against the wall. We noticed that the violence was increasingly moving towards the garage, as the enemy was presumably being pushed back further. Bullet holes appeared in the garage roof, and the large doors did not escape damage either. Windows were frequently shattered. It became much more dangerous here than in the church with its thick walls. Suddenly, we heard the roar of engines. They were airplanes. Could they be Dutch? But soon we saw they were German planes. What were they here for? The planes flew low. The Germans positioned in the blooming tulip fields waved at the planes. Now we saw large bombs falling from the planes. What? Were they bombing their own soldiers? But it turned out not to be ordinary bombs as large parachutes deployed from them. Slowly, the contraptions descended. We suspected that the enemy was being dropped ammunition and supplies. This was not pleasant for us as we had hoped, that the Germans would run out of supplies, but now that was no longer likely. Meanwhile, the machine guns rattled furiously, and the Dutch soldiers fired at the planes, but they soon disappeared after dropping their cargo. Shortly after, we were startled by a grenade exploding close to the garage. This went wrong. Soon after, a severely wounded German was brought in. He had been hit by that grenade. He was laid on the floor and bandaged with emergency dressings. The man was in a hopeless condition, he needed to be transported away, and 4 prisoners of war, including myself, were chosen for this task. We were not keen to venture outside the garage as it was even more dangerous out there than inside. But we had no say in the matter, so we had to go. The wounded man was placed on a door, and with this unfortunate stretcher, we had to transport him. This would be something. Through one of the windows, a farmhouse 800 meters behind the garage was pointed out as our destination. My friends said I should refuse, but it would have been futile. So we set off with the heavy burden. I thought of my previous wounded transport at the airport. What awaited me now? A German soldier led us with a white cloth on a stick held high, which was supposed to protect us as a Red Cross flag. There we went, straight through the beautiful tulip fields. It was a shame to trample the flowers, but we had no choice as we had to take the shortest route. It was a tough journey. The ditches between the fields were difficult obstacles, and it was not easy to step over them willingly. Sometimes one of us stepped right in the middle, causing the door to tilt and the wounded man almost to slide off. Often, we had to set down the stretcher to switch shoulders or suddenly seek cover from the whistling bullets. Fortunately, the grenades left us alone, although they repeatedly exploded in the village. That it was a clumsy transport is understandable, but the wounded man noticed nothing, he was completely unconscious. Perhaps already dead. The German escorting us also did not care much for this transport, moving across the open field without any cover. For most of the way, he walked deeply stooped. Thus, he could not keep the white flag raised, which put us in greater danger. Moreover, we had to walk upright to carry the heavy load as best as possible. We were relieved when we finally arrived at the farmhouse. 2 Red Cross flags fluttered cheerfully in the spring sunshine on a farmhouse and a barn. Now we understood that the farmhouse served as a hospital, thus a so-called field hospital. We were surprised to see so many Germans walking around, all healthy with their weapons. Was this a wounded stay or a fortress? Later, it became increasingly clear that the enemy was seriously abusing the Red Cross flags that provided them with splendid but unauthorized protection. We entered the farmhouse from the back. There we were in a large part, where the floor was covered with a layer of straw, on which about 25 wounded lay, all Germans. We placed our wounded there, but the man was more dead than alive and now moaned continuously. A German officer, who turned out to be a captain doctor, examined him but shook his head and left him lying as we had laid him. He died shortly thereafter. Meanwhile, we foresaw a group of civilians in a corner of the barn. We went over to them and got acquainted. They were the owner of the farmhouse, Van Leven, his farmhand Gert, his neighbor Van Egmond with his wife and approximately 14-year-old daughter, J. de Rood, a person from Valkenburg, and a worker. The woman and children of farmer Van Leven were somewhere in the vicinity of the village. The farmer was ignorant and anxious about them. He told us that the Germans had taken over his farmhouse to accommodate the wounded. He himself had to settle for a place in the barn, which he shared with the civilians who had sought refuge there. Only the front room was left alone by the Germans. The rest of the farmhouse, which was almost new, was taken over by the Germans. There were also a few Dutch soldiers in the farmhouse, namely 2 hospital soldiers and 3 infantrymen, making a total of 9 Dutch soldiers with us 4 included. I was the only artilleryman. We were keen to stay in this hospital, but we were told that we would be brought back to the garage at dusk. That was a disappointment because here it was much safer, and we could sleep on straw. Moreover, we had every chance of getting enough to eat. We hoped that they would forget about us in the evening. And sure enough, they forgot to bring us back, so we stayed in the hospital. That was a 100% relief for us. Around the farmhouse, it was much quieter than at the church and the garage. Bullets flew over the house, but that was nothing compared to what we had already experienced in the days behind us. It remained relatively quiet because no grenades reached the farmhouse, although occasionally one tried to make it that far. Yet, staying in the hospital was far from appealing. Here we saw the war from another side again. The wounded soldiers showed us what suffering war could bring to healthy young lads. There they lay, seriously and less seriously wounded. One with a smile on his face, another with a face contorted with pain. As we walked among the wounded, we saw that most were wounded in their hands and legs. There was also a Dutch soldier among the Germans. We sat with him for a while. He told us that he had been hit by a bullet in a strange way. When he was in his position, he had his pockets full of cartridges, including the breast pockets. Unfortunately, a bullet hit one of the breast pockets. The bullet ricocheted off the cartridges inside. This caused one to explode. The bullet from his breast pocket wounded him. That's why he was also admitted to this hospital. He was in a lot of pain and did not feel at home among all those Germans. He told us that he was sometimes skipped during mealtime. We took care of him as best we could and often had a chat with him. We also sometimes talked to the Germans, but we could hardly understand them. It was clear to us, though, that they were very interested in the situation in the Netherlands regarding military matters. They also wanted to know the ranks of Dutch officers, but we said nothing more than we wanted to. With the civilians, we also got something to eat. It was bread that we enjoyed very much. It gradually became evening, darkness fell, and we sought a place on the straw and were grateful that we could now lie down comfortably, although it was also spiritually uplifting, something we badly needed in these anxious days. The food we got in the afternoon was good, although it was prepared in the German way, namely potato soup, white beans, and meat, which the farmer had in ample supply. We also got enough other food from the cook, such as cake, cookies, peppermints, sour candies, etc., etc. A real land of milk and honey, although they could have kept all this, plus the war. We also regularly cared for the wounded Dutch soldier, for which he was very grateful. Through the windows, we could see Germans positioned in the bushes around the farmhouse. In a shed, they had a transmitting and receiving device. That, while the Red Cross flags fluttered on the farmhouse and barn. The farmhouse had changed into a wondrous combination, farmhouse, hospital, fortress. Slowly the second day of Pentecost passed. The war had now raged for 4 days, and there was still no end. The Germans were not doing so well here in Valkenburg, but how was it elsewhere in our country? Tuesday, May 14th. Again, we were woken up very early in the morning. What were we to do now? Fetch wounded. A German ordered us to follow him. We each received a pioneer shovel that was not much larger than a child's shovel. With these, we went behind the farmhouse. There, the German indicated to us that we had to dig 2 pits. There, Germans who had died in the hospital were to be buried. At first, we tried to dig under the shrubbery, but that did not work with those awkward shovels, so we had to try somewhere else. Now we went behind the farmhouse in the meadow next to the manure pile. There it went a bit better. Yet, it remained a difficult job, especially to get the grass sods loose, and we were on our knees. The Germans urged us to hurry because he was afraid that the fighting would start again. Then we would no longer be safe there. One of us had the misfortune to break the handle of the shovel. Now only 2 of us could continue digging. It was not a pleasant task to dig 2 graves in that meadow. The German was very precise about our work. The pits had to be exactly rectangular and of the same size. To determine the length, one of us lay down in the pit for a moment. Finally, we were ready. Now we fetched the dead, who lay in a shed, covered with a few sacks. It was difficult to carry the bodies properly, we had to just pick them up. With their full uniforms on, we laid them in the pits, each with a sack over his head. When it was so far, the German took off his helmet and indicated to us that we should also reflect in silence. We did this ourselves out of respect for the dead. They were also people of God's creation, they had found their death here, far from their family and homeland. What we were actually doing here did not really sink in. What were the dead? Why had this happened? Could what we were doing here not have happened to us? Now we were at the beginning of the 5th day of war, and what would it bring for us? 4 long days had death and destruction roamed around us. In those days, our feelings had been dulled, the dead no longer meant anything to us. We saw them as if they were planks. The pits were filled in. Meanwhile, the German fetched a few crosses that had already been made. These were made of a few planks nailed together with the names of the dead written on them in pencil. With meticulous precision, he placed the crosses on the graves. Here in this meadow behind the farmhouse, testimony was borne to the misery that the war brought. The next day, 2 more German soldiers were buried next to them, but I did not help with that. Later, after the war, the 4 bodies were exhumed and transferred elsewhere. Meanwhile, a few shots had already been fired, and soon the battle resumed. Machine guns rattled, guns cracked, bullets whistled, grenades wailed again to end in an explosion. The war raged again like the previous days. At first, it was still somewhat slow, but it did not take long for the battle to reach its full extent again. In the hospital, we were still relatively safe, although bullets whistled around the farmhouse. However, the grenades remained at a reasonable distance, except for an occasional one that came dangerously close. Overall, The days in the hospital were not as dangerous for me as the terrible days at the airport and in the church, but it was not entirely safe, as evidenced by the following chapter. During the day, wounded were regularly brought in, and the barn floor became full. A room was also put into use to lay down the wounded. To make more room, the civilians and us, the prisoners of war, were told to leave our corner on the barn floor and move upstairs to a bedroom. We did not like that because it was much more dangerous upstairs. We missed the protection of the walls. But there was nothing else to do but obey, so we brought straw upstairs to spread on the floor. During the day, we stayed downstairs as much as possible, which was safer. Among the wounded brought in that day were also a few Dutch soldiers, but they were not seriously wounded. One of the German wounded was probably no longer in his right mind. He was wounded in his leg but could not lie still for a moment. He usually walked around, leaning on a stick among the others, singing and whistling the highest song while the other wounded were in agony. He often imitated the whistling of the bullets, causing his comrades to crouch down in fear. In the afternoon around 6 o'clock, the battle for Valkenburg unexpectedly lessened, a few shots still fell, and the artillery fire ceased. What did that mean? It was still not dark, so there was no need for the battle to cease. From the Germans, we learned what was going on. The Netherlands had capitulated, the Dutch army had to lay down its arms. The Royal Dutch Army had defended itself tooth and nail for 5 days, and now the order had come from higher up that the battle had to be given up, and the enemy given the victory. Yes, this was all too true. But that the Dutch soldiers had to lay down their arms was not a defeat, and the aggressor had not achieved a victory over the Netherlands. With such a tremendous army, which had been in preparation for 7 years, it was easy to achieve a victory over an army like the Dutch one, which was still in the early stages of what it had to become. And yet, the enemy had to fight against us for 5 long days. That was a magnificent performance by our army. In addition, the enemy was accompanied by a powerful air fleet that landed in many places in our country and dropped thousands of paratroopers, a means of combat still almost unknown to us, paratroopers in Dutch uniforms. Moreover, the filthiest and lowest betrayal imaginable, witness the Rhine barges in Valkenburg. Betrayal, to which many Dutch had made themselves guilty and who now walked around as patriots, making an ideal of us. Yet, that tremendous army with its paratroopers and treason could not subdue the Dutch army. In addition, the inhumane bombing of Rotterdam on Tuesday afternoon had to give the final push. A bombardment unparalleled in the entire history of warfare for cowardly baseness. The crown on all this was set by the threat that other major cities would also be bombed if the Netherlands did not lay down its arms. General Winkelmann then had to make the inevitable decision: the Netherlands had to capitulate. It became quiet around Valkenburg, which felt strange because it had become such a habit that the fighting only ceased at dusk. Now it was still clear day, although it was beginning to turn towards evening. Together with an infantryman, I had to go under the guidance of a German hospital soldier to fetch a wounded man. We went in the direction of Valkenburg, straight through the tulip fields and farmland. We came close to the garage where I had been before I had to go to the farmhouse with the wounded. Were the other prisoners of war still in the garage? How were they doing? I would have liked to know that. But I got no chance to peek into the garage. What would my friends think of my absence? They could not know that I had come through well. When I left the garage to bring that wounded German to the hospital, we walked further until we came between the outermost houses of Valkenburg. Now I could see for the first time what had been destroyed here. No house had remained unscathed, all showed bullet holes in the walls, doors, and frames and shattered windows. There were also large holes in several houses caused by exploded grenades. Here we were on the edge of the village. How would the church look? The accompanying German asked his colleagues, who were still everywhere, where the wounded man was, but we learned that there was not even a wounded man in the vicinity. The hospital soldier went to talk to the others who were listening to a radio in front of a house. They had a German station on. It was just announced that the Netherlands had capitulated. The German told us this, and we could understand him more or less. Afterward, they talked animatedly and found it necessary to call the Dutch soldiers swinehounds because they had mercilessly fired on Valkenburg. We said nothing to that because we knew all too well who was mainly to blame for that. The Germans were in a good mood now that the battle was over, and they were no longer in the grenade bombardment. We prisoners of war were grateful that this slaughter was over after we had sat in it helplessly for 5 long days. For those who had spent these unforgettable days in trenches and positions to protect Dutch freedom and independence, it was a great disappointment to be handed over to the enemy just like that. Hundreds of brave defenders had perished in this unequal struggle, and how many had become mutilated and disabled for life. The capitulation was very hard for those men. What would now happen to our country and people? We will now be honored by the Germans, and our country will be occupied by them militarily. We will miss our freedom, and what else will be taken from us? We also learned that the royal house and the government had fled to England. What were we to think of that? Had the Queen not recently said that she would remain by the side of the people, whatever may happen? Why had she left us while thousands of young men were putting their lives in the service of our fatherland? Why had she departed while her people were in distress? That the princess with her little daughters had fled was understandable, but why the Queen then? And why the government? Their departure would surely disappoint the entire people. Later, we learned why they had gone, and now we know, now we feel that their departure was the right way. Now the Queen and Prince Bernhard with the government in London are fighting with the part of the Dutch army, particularly the fleet, the battle with England and other peoples oppressed by tyranny, to continue the fight against the barbaric enemy. The Queen is now separated from her fatherland and people whom she has ruled for more than 40 years under very difficult circumstances, but now in the greatest difficulties imaginable. She is removed from her daughter and grandchildren. She resides in London, for us a symbol of courage and trust, a comforting thought for a people in an occupied fatherland. The Queen, the Prince, the government, and the Dutch army in England are now all fighting for the cause that is just. They will win because right will prevail. The orange sun will once again shine in full glory over old Netherlands. We in the occupied area have sincere admiration for the men who still risk their lives every day for our liberation, and we can contribute much here, despite the strict measures of the occupier. That is also being done because even now there are martyrs who are deprived of life for the good cause. The Dutch people live and fight on, and therefore we have not lost this war. Princess Juliana with the children Beatrix and Irene are now safe in Canada, to which they were brought by the Dutch warship to Sumatra. We were still with the Germans in Valkenburg. They talked and laughed and found it senseless that the Dutch had resisted the Germans. Their army was invincible. They scorned the Queen and the government because they had fled. What could we counter with? Nothing, and that was just as well. Later, we knew better. Because there was no wounded, we returned without having accomplished anything. We heard Appel being blown in the distance. That was the signal for the Dutch soldiers to come out of their positions and gather. They had to break off their task just at the moment when they were gaining war experience. For them, the capitulation was extraordinarily disappointing because the enemy could not have held out much longer at Valkenburg if help had not arrived. When we returned to the farm hospital, the civilians and the wounded were much more cheerful now that the battle that had turned Valkenburg into a hell was over. The wife of Van Egmond, and her little daughter left the farmhouse to find shelter elsewhere, where it was better than here among all the wounded, where there were now about 50. Ambulances came to pick up the most severely wounded to take them to a hospital. In the evening, we went upstairs early to sleep on the straw. Now it was no longer so dangerous to be upstairs. We had nothing more to fear from bullets and grenades. That night, despite wearing the uniform we had kept on, we had a good and restful night. In the other bedrooms, German soldiers slept. They had been in the fire against our army for 5 days. It was quite cozy to have such people in company. Now the 5th and last day of the war was over. This concludes the 4th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of these first days of the war for the Netherlands? Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.